4,000 years ago, in the ancient city of Uruk, what would become the oldest story ever written was carved into clay. It told of a king who was 2 parts god and 1 part man, the strongest, most beautiful ruler the world had ever seen. But he was also the cruelest. He took what he wanted, when he wanted, and worked his men to death. And so his people cried out to the gods for release, and the gods, hearing their pleas, answered. They created a second man to match him, a wild creature born of clay, raised by animals, sent to bring the king to his knees. But what followed was not what anyone had expected. A friendship was born that would change both men forever, drawing them into a journey across the ends of the earth, to the doorway of the gods themselves, and to a search no mortal had ever dared undertake, a quest for the one thing no king can ever claim, eternal life. Lost for 2,000 years beneath the sands of a forgotten empire and recovered only by chance in the ruins of a fallen city, join us as we take you step by step through the greatest story of the ancient world. I'm David Rintoul. This is Deep Dive History, the podcast where we explore the myths, the empires, and the people that have shaped our world. And you're listening to Episode 5, The Epic of Gilgamesh. Prologue. Finding the oldest story ever written. Before we begin the tale of Gilgamesh, it is worth knowing where this tale comes from, for its history is almost as remarkable as the story itself. In 1849, a young English adventurer named Austin Henry Layard was tunnelling through a vast mound of earth on the banks of the river Tigris in what is now northern Iraq. He had come to the Middle East intending to reach Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, but had been drawn instead to the mysterious ruins that dotted the landscape of ancient Mesopotamia, great hills of packed earth that the local people said were the remains of buried cities. The mound Layard chose to excavate concealed one of the greatest cities of them all, the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire. As Layard's workmen dug deeper, they began to uncover the remains of a vast palace, built by King Sennacherib, a name familiar to anyone who had read the Bible, the Assyrian king who had besieged Jerusalem and terrorized the kingdoms of the ancient world. Its corridors were lined with enormous stone slabs carved with scenes of battle and conquest, and images of a civilization that had vanished from the earth over 2,000 years before. Layard sketched everything he found, documenting every chamber and carved slab, so that even if the ruins crumbled further, a record would survive. But the most extraordinary discovery was not on the walls. In one chamber of the palace, Layard found a library constructed by the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, a ruler who had valued learning as highly as military conquest. In the library, Layard stumbled across a mound of small clay tablets, covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, a script that few alive could read. Over 30,000 of these tablets would be discovered in total, an almost incomprehensible quantity of ancient knowledge, more than had been found at any other ancient site before. But Layard could not read a single one, and so he packed them into crates and shipped them to the British Museum in London, where they sat in storage rooms and basements, waiting for someone with the skill and patience to unlock their secrets. That someone arrived 15 years later in 1866. His name was George Smith, And he was not an academic or an aristocrat, but a young engraver from a London printing firm who had taught himself to read the ancient script, known as cuneiform, in his spare time. In 1872, while sorting through a stack of tablets marked M for mythology, Smith came across a fragment unlike any other. As he carefully translated the cuneiform, a story began to emerge. A man warned by a god to build a great boat, to load it with his family and the animals of the field, and wait for a catastrophic flood sent by the gods to destroy mankind. The parallels to the story of Noah were unmistakable, but this version was far, far older than anything in the Bible. As more tablets were identified and translated in the years that followed, a far larger narrative began to take shape around the flood story. It was not a standalone myth, but a single episode within a much longer epic poem, a story spanning 11 tablets that told of a king named Gilgamesh. Scholars would eventually trace the poem's origins back over 4,000 years, through multiple versions and languages, to the very dawn of written literature. The earliest tales of Gilgamesh had been composed in Sumerian, the oldest known literary language, around 2100 BC. Over the centuries, Babylonian poets began weaving them together into a single, connected narrative, until sometime around 1200 BC, an ancient Mesopotamian scholar named Sinleki Unini produced the version we know today, a complete epic that he titled He Who Saw the Deep. His text was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, passed from scribe to scribe across the temples and libraries of the ancient world, until the civilization that created it finally crumbled and the tablets were buried in the ruins. What Smith had found in that dusty storeroom at the British Museum was nothing less than the oldest surviving story in human history, older than Homer's Iliad and Odyssey by more than 1,000 years, and older than the Bible by over 2,000. It is a story that tells of the most powerful man in the world, a king who is part mortal and part god, who chooses to abuse that power at the expense of his people. It asks questions about how a king should rule, and what may become of a man with unrestrained power. It is a tale of friendship, of how finding someone who truly understands who we are can change us for the better, and of the grief that follows when they are taken from us. But more than anything, it is a story about death. It asks the one question that every human being must eventually face. Knowing that we are going to die, what do we do with the time we have? This is humanity's oldest surviving story, and it is, at its heart, the story of what it means to be human. And it begins, as all the oldest stories do, with a king and a city. Part 1. The King of Uruk. For years, the people had been crying out for help. In the city of Uruk, fathers wept over sons who had been worked to death in the king's endless games. Brides were taken from their husbands on the night of the wedding before the marriage could even be consummated. No man could stand against him, no family could hide a daughter from him, and no voice in the city could be raised in protest without consequence. Their king was the strongest man who had ever lived, and he was destroying them. His name was Gilgamesh. He was the son of a goddess, born of a union between a great king and the divine. 2 parts of him were said to be immortal, only 1 part mortal, and his body had been sculpted to perfection by the gods themselves. He stood taller than any man in Uruk. His shoulders were broad, his arms thick with muscle, and his long black hair fell about a face so striking that those who saw him for the first time often forgot to speak. He was beautiful, terrible, and utterly without equal. No warrior could match him in combat, no wall could keep him out, no challenge in the known world could satisfy him for long. And that was the problem. The gods had given him the body of a hero, but they had not given him the wisdom to use it well. His strength, which should have been the protection of his people, had become the instrument of their suffering. The city he ruled was the greatest in the world. Uruk lay in the fertile lands between two great rivers, in a region that would one day be called Mesopotamia, where humanity had first learned to build cities, to dig canals, and to write. Its walls stretched for 6 miles across the plain, encircling temples, orchards, and marketplaces, and the homes of tens of thousands of people. Travelers approaching from the desert could see the city shimmering on the horizon long before they reached its gates. According to legend, the foundations of its walls had been laid at the dawn of time by the 7 sages, divine beings sent down from the heavens to teach mankind the arts of civilization. This was the city Gilgamesh had inherited, and it was the city he was breaking. Day and night the people of Uruk cried out for relief. Their laments rose above the city walls and into the heavens. "Gilgamesh leaves no son to his father," they wept. "He leaves no bride to her groom, and yet he is their king. He is supposed to protect them." The gods heard every word. It was Anu, the great sky god and father of the heavens, who acted first. He summoned Aruru, the mother goddess who had shaped the first humans out of clay at the dawn of creation, and he gave her a task. If the gods had made Gilgamesh too powerful for any man to oppose, then the gods would have to make his equal. "You created mankind," he told her. "Now use that same power to fashion his equal. Make a companion for him who can match him in strength, so that the two of them can contend with each other, and Uruk can finally know peace." Aruru washed her hands. She took a single pinch of clay, the same substance from which the first humans had been made, and she cast it down into the wilderness, far from the city and far from the eyes of men. Where the clay landed, a man began to rise from the earth. His name was Enkidu, and he was everything Gilgamesh was not. Where Gilgamesh was civilized, Enkidu was wild. Where Gilgamesh was beautiful, Enkidu was wild and untamed, his body covered in thick, matted hair. He knew nothing of cities or temples, nothing of clothing or speech or fire. He lived on the open steppe with the animals, running with the herds of gazelles, drinking with them at their watering holes, eating the grass of the plains. He was perhaps as strong as Gilgamesh, perhaps stronger, but he had no idea that a great city stood beyond the horizon, or that a king sat within its walls whose fate had already been bound to his own. For a time, Enkidu lived in peace among the animals, but he could not remain hidden forever. In the lands at the edge of the wild, a trapper began to notice that something was wrong. His snares were being torn apart, his pits were being filled in, his nets had been ripped to pieces in a way no animal could have managed. And when he hid one day near the watering hole to find out what was happening, he saw it. An enormous wild man moving among the herds as though he were one of them. The trapper was so frightened that he ran home to his father, barely able to speak. His father listened to the story and thought carefully before he replied. "Go to Uruk," he said. "Go to the temple of Ishtar, the goddess of love, and bring back one of her priestesses. Take her to the watering hole. Let her show herself to this wild man. When he lies with her, the animals will no longer accept him as one of their own, and his strength will leave the wilderness and pass into the world of men." The trapper did as his father had told him. He travelled to the great city, came to the temple, and returned with a priestess named Shamhat, a woman who served Ishtar through the rites of sacred love. Together they waited at the edge of the watering hole, and for 2 days they saw nothing but herds of gazelles coming down to drink. On the 3rd day, the animals came again, and walking among them, as comfortable and unself-conscious as the wild creatures themselves, came Enkidu. When Shamhat saw him, she did not flinch. She loosened her robes and let him see her, and Enkidu, who had never seen a woman before, and could not have named the feeling that now rose in his chest, was drawn to her by a force he could not resist. For 6 days and 7 nights they lay together at the edge of the watering hole. The herd waited nearby, grazing in the long grass as the days slipped past. When Enkidu rose at last and turned back toward the animals, they scattered at his approach. The wild creatures he had lived among his entire life now fled from him in terror, as though they sensed that something fundamental in him had changed. He tried to follow them, but his legs would no longer carry him as they once had. His body felt heavier, slower. The wilderness itself had cast him out. Confused and afraid, he turned back to the woman who had changed his life. "You have become wise, Enkidu," Shamhat told him gently. "Why would you want to run with the animals when you could walk among men?" She told him about Uruk, about its mighty walls, its great temples, its markets, and its music, and the taste of bread dipped in beer. And she told him about Gilgamesh, the king who terrorized his own people, who took every bride for himself and drove every young man to the breaking point. Something stirred in Enkidu's chest when he heard this. Not fear and not anger, but a longing for the one thing the wilderness had never given him, a companion. Someone who might match him in strength and speed, someone who might understand what it meant to be powerful and what it meant to be alone. "Take me there," he said. "I will challenge this Gilgamesh and see if he truly is as strong as you say." Part 2. Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Shamhat led Enkidu away from the watering hole and toward the world of men, but the journey to Uruk would not be immediate. First she brought him to a shepherd's camp on the edge of the steppe, where herdsmen lived in simple tents and watched over their flocks through the long nights. It was here, among these quiet, practical men, that Enkidu would take his first steps into civilization. Everything was new to him. He had never eaten anything but grass and wild plants, so when the shepherds set bread before him, he only stared in confusion. Shamhat chuckled and picked up the bread, showing him how to tear and chew it, movements Enkidu slowly learned to mimic. Once that was mastered, she taught him how to raise a cup of beer to his lips and drink. At first he coughed and spluttered, but the taste was unlike anything he had known, rich and warm, and he drank 7 cups in a row until his face flushed red and his head grew light. He laughed for the first time in his life, a sound so strange and unexpected that the shepherds stopped their work to stare. They cut the matted hair that covered his body and rubbed him with oil, then dressed him in a simple tunic. When Enkidu caught sight of his reflection in a basin of still water, he barely recognized the man looking back at him. He was no longer a creature of the wild. He looked like a man, and for the first time he felt like one too. He stayed with the shepherds for a while, guarding their flocks against the wolves and lions that prowled the steppe at night. He was a natural protector, his strength making him fearless where other men would have fled, and the shepherds came to regard him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. But Enkidu's thoughts kept returning to Uruk and the king Shamhat had described. When a traveller passed through the camp one evening, Enkidu asked for news of the city. The man's face darkened. "There is to be a wedding feast tonight," he said, "but no one celebrates. The king will go to the bride before her husband, as he always does. No one can stop him, no one dares to try." Enkidu felt his blood rise. He had only just learned the laws of men, but already he knew that this could not be allowed to stand. He turned to Shamhat and told her it was time to leave. Together they set out for Uruk. When Enkidu entered the city through its great gates, the people of Uruk stopped and stared. He was enormous and broad across the shoulders, his bearing radiating a strength that reminded them of someone they knew all too well. "He looks like Gilgamesh," they whispered to each other. "He is built like Gilgamesh." Some felt hope stirring for the first time in years. Perhaps this stranger was the answer to their prayers. Enkidu made his way through the streets toward the wedding house, where the ceremony was already underway. The bride waited inside, frightened, knowing what would come when the feast ended and the king arrived to claim his right. Her husband stood beside her, powerless to protect her, his fists clenched at his sides. Then Enkidu heard footsteps approaching, heavy and confident, the stride of a man who had never been challenged in his life. Gilgamesh was coming, flanked by attendants, his eyes already fixed on the doorway of the wedding house. Enkidu stepped into his path and planted his feet. Gilgamesh stopped. For a moment the two men simply looked at each other. It was like looking into a mirror forged by the gods, the same impossible strength, the same towering frame, but where Gilgamesh was polished and regal, Enkidu was raw and wild, unburdened by the rules and restrictions of the civilized world. "You will not enter," Enkidu said. No one had ever spoken to Gilgamesh like that. No one had ever stood in his way and refused to move. His expression shifted from surprise to fury, and he lunged forward, seizing Enkidu by the shoulders. What followed shook the city to its foundations. The two men grappled in the narrow street, their bodies locked together, each straining to throw the other. The walls of the houses around them trembled as they crashed into them. Door frames cracked and shattered. Dust rose in clouds as their feet tore up the packed earth beneath them. The people of Uruk fled to their rooftops to watch, hardly daring to breathe, as the two strongest men in the world fought for dominance. They were perfectly matched. Every time Gilgamesh forced Enkidu back, Enkidu found new footing and pushed forward again. Every time Enkidu gained an advantage, Gilgamesh twisted free and came at him from a different angle. The fight raged through the street and into the marketplace, stalls collapsing around them, until finally Gilgamesh managed to throw Enkidu to the ground, pinning him with a strength born of the gods. For a moment, Enkidu lay there, breathing hard, his back against the broken earth. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of rage or humiliation, Enkidu looked up at the man who had bested him and felt something entirely unexpected. Respect. And when he looked into Gilgamesh's eyes, he saw the same feeling reflected back at him. Gilgamesh released his grip and stepped back. Then he reached down and offered Enkidu his hand. Enkidu took it, and as Gilgamesh pulled him to his feet, the two men embraced. It was not the embrace of opponents who had fought to a standstill, but of two halves of a whole who had finally found each other. The people of Uruk watched in astonishment as their tyrant king held this wild stranger and wept, not from pain or anger, but from the overwhelming relief of no longer being alone. From that day forward, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were inseparable. They ate together, trained together, and walked the walls of Uruk side by side. Enkidu's presence changed Gilgamesh in ways that no amount of prayer or protest had managed. The endless competitions ceased. The young men of the city were given rest. The brides were left to their husbands. It was as though Enkidu had absorbed the restless, destructive energy that had made Gilgamesh such a terror, channeling it into something warmer, something almost gentle. But peace did not sit easily on Gilgamesh's shoulders. He was still 2 parts god, still burning with a need to prove himself, to do something that would outlast his mortal life. As the weeks passed, Enkidu noticed a change in his friend. Gilgamesh grew restless again, not in the cruel, careless way of before, but with a deeper agitation, a hunger that the pleasures of the city could not satisfy. "What troubles you?" Enkidu asked one evening as they sat together on the walls of Uruk, watching the sun set over the distant steppe. Gilgamesh was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Enkidu had not heard before. "I am going to die one day, Enkidu. I am stronger than any man alive, but I am still mortal. One day I will grow old and weak, and everything I have done will be forgotten, unless I do something so great that men will speak my name long after I am dust." He turned to his friend, and there was a fire in his eyes. "Far to the west, there is a forest of sacred cedars, guarded by a creature called Humbaba. He is a monster appointed by the god Enlil, lord of the earth, and his roar is said to be a flood that sweeps away all before it. No man has ever challenged him and returned alive." Enkidu felt a chill pass through him. He had heard of Humbaba in his days in the wild. The animals spoke of that forest in the only way animals could, by never going near it. "Gilgamesh," he said carefully, "I know this creature. His breath is fire. His voice is death. Enlil, the mightiest of the gods, set him there to guard the cedars. This is not a quest. It is a death sentence." But Gilgamesh only smiled. "Then I will die with my name on the lips of every man in Uruk. What is a life of comfort compared to a legacy that lasts forever?" Enkidu smiled back. "Then I will die with you. For what sort of a friend would I be if I let you have all that fun alone?" Part 3. The Cedar Forest. Word of the quest spread quickly through Uruk, and the reaction was not what Gilgamesh had hoped for. The elders of the city, men who had governed through decades of war and peace, came to the palace and begged him to reconsider. "You are young, Gilgamesh," one of the elders told him. "Your heart has carried you towards something it does not understand. Humbaba is all but invincible. You can hear the faintest footsteps from hundreds of miles away. Please, do not throw your life away. Our city needs its king." Gilgamesh listened politely, then dismissed them. He had already made his decision. But there was one person whose counsel he could not so easily ignore. His mother, the goddess Ninsun, had heard of her son's plans and summoned him to her chamber. When Gilgamesh arrived, he found her dressed not in her usual robes, but in ceremonial garments, her expression grave. She did not try to talk him out of it. She knew her son too well for that. Instead, she climbed the steps to the roof of the temple, lit sacred incense, and raised her arms to the sky. She was praying to Shamash, the sun god, the divine protector of travellers, and the one deity who might be able to keep her son alive on the road ahead. "Shamash!" she called out, her voice carrying into the heavens. "You gave my son a restless heart. You planted in him the need for glory that will not let him be still. If you are the one who set him on this path, then you must protect him on it. Watch over him in the cedar forest. Keep him safe from the creature that guards it. And when the sun sets each night on his journey, let the stars guard him until you return." When she descended from the roof, she turned to Enkidu, speaking with genuine warmth. "You have saved my son from himself. Since he has known you, the people look to him with hope rather than fear." She took him by the hand. "I know you have no family to call your own, so from this day forward, I claim you as my own. You're a son of this house now, brother to Gilgamesh, bound to him by a bond that no distance or danger can break." She placed a sacred pendant around his neck, the mark of her household, and Enkidu bowed his head, overwhelmed by its significance. He had been born from clay, raised by animals, and civilized by a priestess. Now a goddess was calling him her son. He had never belonged to anyone or anything before. Now he belonged to a family. The two friends left Uruk at dawn, their weapons forged by the city's finest smiths, their packs loaded with provisions for the long road ahead. The people gathered to watch them go, and Gilgamesh could see in their faces a mixture of pride and fear. They were cheering for their king, but many of them believed they were seeing him for the last time. The journey to the cedar forest was long, covering distances that would have taken ordinary men many weeks. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu were not ordinary men, and they covered the ground at a pace that would have exhausted any companions. They walked from dawn until dusk, barely stopping to rest, as though the quest itself was pulling them forward. It was during the nights that their friendship deepened into something neither had experienced before. They would build a fire in whatever shelter the landscape offered, and as the darkness pressed in around them, they would talk. Gilgamesh spoke of Uruk, of the weight of kingship, of the loneliness that came with being stronger than everyone around him. He had never been able to speak honestly with anyone before. Every conversation in the palace was coloured by fear or flattery. But Enkidu had no reason to flatter him and no capacity for deception. He simply listened, and when he spoke, he told the truth. Enkidu in turn spoke of the wilderness, of what it felt like to run with the herds at dawn, the grass wet beneath his feet, and the wind carrying the scent of rain from distant mountains. He spoke of the silence of the steppe at night, a silence so vast that you could hear the stars turning above you. And he spoke of the loneliness that came with living among creatures who could never truly know him, who would scatter at a raised voice or a sudden movement. He had been free, but he had been utterly alone. "I think the gods made us for each other," Enkidu said one evening, staring into the fire. "You were alone in your city. I was alone in my wilderness, and neither of us knew what we were missing until we found it." Gilgamesh said nothing, but he reached out and gripped his friend's arm, and the gesture said more than words could. But the nights also brought fear. As they drew closer to the forest, Gilgamesh began to have dreams, vivid and terrifying visions that woke him panicked and gasping. In one, a great mountain collapsed on top of him, crushing him beneath its weight. In another, a wild bull charged from the darkness and pinned him to the ground, its breath hot against his face. Each time he woke, trembling, reaching for Enkidu in the darkness. Each time Enkidu was there. "The mountain that fell on you is Humbaba," Enkidu told him, his voice calm, "and we will bring him down. The bull is the strength you will need, and it comes to you because Shamash sends it. These are not warnings, Gilgamesh. They are promises." Whether Enkidu truly believed his own interpretations or simply said what his friend needed to hear, Gilgamesh never asked. But the words steadied him, and each morning they pressed on, closer and closer to the forest that no man had entered and lived to speak of. When they finally reached the cedar forest, both men fell silent. Nothing could have prepared them for it. The trees were enormous, taller than anything either of them had seen, their trunks so wide that 10 men could not have encircled them with outstretched arms. The canopy above was so thick that the sunlight filtered through in golden shafts, illuminating a floor of soft needles and cool shadow. The air smelled of cedar resin, rich and sharp, and the silence was absolute, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "It is beautiful," Gilgamesh whispered. Enkidu nodded, but his hand was on his weapon. He could feel something watching them from the shadows between the trees. They began to fell the cedars, the crash of each tree echoing through the forest like thunder, drawing Humbaba out of the depths. The guardian of the forest was unlike any creature they had faced. He was enormous, his face like that of a lion, broad and snarling, but stretched and distorted into something horrific. When he spoke, the trees bent away from him, and when he roared, the ground itself trembled. Around him hung 7 auras of terror the gods had granted him, divine protections that radiated dread so powerful that even the bravest warrior would find his courage dissolving. Gilgamesh felt the auras hit him like a wave of freezing water. His muscles locked. His sword suddenly felt impossibly heavy. For the first time in his life, the king of Uruk wanted to run. "Do not be afraid," Enkidu said beside him, though his own voice was shaking. "We came here together. We fight together. Shamash is watching." As if in answer, a great wind rose from the south, then the north, then the east and west. Shamash had sent 13 winds to batter Humbaba, stripping away his auras one by one, each gust tearing a layer of divine protection from the monster until he stood diminished, still terrible but no longer invincible. Humbaba staggered under the assault, and it was then that Gilgamesh found his courage. He charged forward, his axe raised, and together with Enkidu they fell upon the guardian of the forest. The battle was fierce, but with Shamash's winds holding Humbaba in place, the two friends fought with a fury that overwhelmed the creature. When Humbaba finally fell to his knees, bleeding and broken, he looked up at Gilgamesh with something unexpected in his expression. "Mercy," Humbaba said. "Spare me, Gilgamesh. I will serve you. I will give you all the cedars you desire. I will be the guardian of your kingdom instead of this forest. Let me live, and I will make you the most powerful king in the world." Gilgamesh hesitated. The creature before him was defeated and helpless. There was a part of him, the part that would one day grow into wisdom, that wanted to grant the request. What glory was there in killing a beaten enemy? But Enkidu stepped forward, his face hard. "Do not listen to him. He will say anything to survive. The moment you turn your back, he will strike, And if Enlil learns that you spared his guardian, his anger will fall on both of us. Kill him now, Gilgamesh. End it while you can." Humbaba turned his gaze on Enkidu, and in that moment all pretense of submission vanished. "You," Humbaba spat, his voice full of venom. "You are the one who counsels death. You, who were raised by animals and knowing nothing of the ways of gods. Know this, wild man. You will die first. Your friend will live on while you rot in the earth. That will be the price of your viciousness." The curse hung in the air like smoke. Enkidu said nothing, only nodding to his friend to finish what they had started. Gilgamesh raised his axe and brought it down. When Humbaba fell, the silence that followed was deeper than any the forest had known. The cedars stood motionless, their great trunks casting long shadows in the fading light. The guardian who had watched over them since the dawn of time was gone, and something in the order of the world had shifted. The two men felled the mightiest cedar in the forest, and Enkidu fashioned it into an enormous door, intended as an offering for the temple of Enlil in the distant city of Nippur, a peace offering to the god whose servant they had just killed. Whether it would be enough to satisfy Enlil's anger, neither of them knew. Loading the timber onto rafts, they sailed back down the river towards Uruk, victorious in their quest. But as the forest disappeared behind them, Enkidu found himself unable to shake the echo of Humbaba's dying words. Part 4. Ishtar and the Bull of Heaven. Gilgamesh and Enkidu returned to Uruk as heroes. The people lined the streets to watch them pass, cheering for the men who had done what no one believed possible. The timber from the cedar forest was unloaded and stored, enough to build temples and palaces for generations. Meanwhile, the great door Enkidu had fashioned was sent to the temple of Enlil in Nippur, carried on a sacred barge down the river in a ceremony that lasted for days. But it was Gilgamesh himself who drew the most attention. After weeks in the wilderness, he had bathed and dressed in his finest robes, his thick hair oiled and braided, his crown restored to his head. He looked every inch the king, more magnificent than he had ever been, radiating the confidence of a man who had faced a monster and won. High above the city, from the walls of her great temple, the goddess Ishtar looked down upon Gilgamesh and felt desire stir within her. Ishtar was not a goddess to be taken lightly. She was the most powerful female deity in all of Mesopotamia, the goddess of both love and war, as capable of destroying armies as she was of inflaming passion. When she wanted something, she took it, and what she wanted now was Gilgamesh. She appeared before him in all her divine beauty. "Come to me, Gilgamesh," she said, her voice warm and caressing. "Be my husband. I will give you a chariot of gold and lapis lazuli, with wheels of gold and horns of precious amber. Kings and princes will kneel before you. Your goats will bear triplets, your ewes twins, your oxen will have no equal." It was the kind of offer most men would have accepted without a second thought. A goddess was proposing marriage, proposing wealth and power beyond mortal imagination. But Gilgamesh rejected Ishtar. Not only did he refuse, but he did so with a cruelty that left even Enkidu speechless. Standing before the most dangerous goddess in the heavens, Gilgamesh looked her in the eye and spoke. "And what would I have to give you in return?" he began, his voice carrying across the courtyard for all to hear. "What happens to the men you love, Ishtar? Where are they now?" He began to count them off, one by one. "There was Tammuz, the lover of your youth. You loved him, and then you condemned him to weep for eternity. Then there was the colourful bird you once adored, until you broke his wing and left him in the forest, crying out in pain. And did you think I had forgotten about the poor lion, once so perfect in strength, for whom you dug 7 pits to fall into?" He was not finished. "There was the shepherd who tended his flock and baked bread for you every day, until you grew bored and turned him into a wolf. His own dogs tore him apart. And what of your father's gardener, who brought you baskets of dates every morning? You desired him, he refused, so you turned him into the first dwarf and condemned him to live in the dirt forever." Gilgamesh spread his hands, laughing as if the goddess's proposal had been some sort of divine joke. "This is what you do to those you love, Ishtar. You're a door that lets in the wind and the rain. You're a waterskin that cuts the hands of the one who drinks from it. You're a shoe that bites its owner's foot. Which of your lovers did you keep forever? Which one did you not destroy?" The silence that followed was absolute. The people of Uruk held their breath. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Ishtar's face transformed from desire to a fury beyond anything mortal rage could match. Without a word, she ascended to the heavens and stormed before her father Anu, the sky god, tears of humiliation and anger streaming down her face. "Father," she demanded, "Gilgamesh has mocked me before his entire city. Give me the bull of heaven so I can punish him. Give it to me, or I will break open the gates of the underworld and let the dead pour out to feast upon the living." Anu hesitated. The bull of heaven was a catastrophic weapon, capable of causing years of famine wherever it set foot. "If I give you the bull," he warned, "there will be 7 years of drought. Have you sorted enough grain for the people?" "I have stored enough," Ishtar replied, her patience gone. "Now give me what I ask." Anu nodded grimly. The bull of heaven descended on Uruk. The destruction was immediate and terrible. When the bull snorted, great cracks opened in the earth, swallowing hundreds of men into the ground below. Warriors who had celebrated their king just hours before now fled in terror as the divine beast laid waste to the city they had fought so hard to protect. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu had not survived Humbaba only to fall before another monster. They had fought side by side in the cedar forest, and they fought side by side now. Enkidu circled behind the creature and seized it by its massive tail, digging his heels into the ground and using all his strength to hold it in place. The bull thrashed and bellowed, but Enkidu would not let go, giving Gilgamesh the opening he needed. The king of Uruk drove his sword into the base of the bull's neck, finding the spot between the horns where the spine met the skull, and the creature crashed to the ground, the light fading from its eyes. The people erupted in celebration, but Ishtar, who had been watching from the walls of her temple, let out a wail. "Gilgamesh mocked me, and now he has killed the bull of heaven? Are there no limits to his disrespect?" Enkidu, noticing Ishtar for the first time, tore the bull's hindquarters from its body and hurled it at the goddess. The bloody meat flew past the goddess, missing her face by inches before hitting the wall of her temple with a wet thud. "Be quiet, you!" Enkidu called up to her. "If I could reach you, I would drape its guts across your arms, or worse." The look of shock on the goddess's face was worth more to Enkidu than any treasure in Uruk. Ishtar let out a cry of anger, but did not challenge Gilgamesh further. Instead, she gathered her priestesses around her, and together they mourned over the remains of the Bull of Heaven, a sacred being that now lay desecrated in the streets of Uruk. That night, the city celebrated like never before. Wine flowed through the streets, music filled the air, and Gilgamesh and Enkidu were carried through the crowds on the shoulders of grateful citizens. They had killed Humbaba, they had slain the Bull of Heaven, they had humiliated a goddess and lived to tell the tale. It seemed as though nothing could touch them, as though the two of them together were more powerful than the gods themselves. But in the heavens a divine assembly was already gathering, and the mood among the gods was very different from the celebrations below. Gilgamesh and Enkidu had killed Enlil's guardian. They had slaughtered Anu's sacred bull. They had openly mocked the goddess Ishtar. These were not the acts of heroes. These were the acts of men who had forgotten their place. Someone would have to pay. The only question was who. Part 5. The Death of Enkidu. That night, as the sounds of celebration still drifted through the streets of Uruk, Enkidu had a dream. He found himself standing in a vast hall, though he could not remember how he had arrived there. The air was heavy and still, and seated before him were figures of such immense presence that he knew at once they were gods. This was the divine assembly, the council where the rulers of heaven decided the fate of the world. And they were arguing about him. "They have gone too far," said Enlil, lord of the earth, his voice like the rumble of a distant storm. "They killed Humbaba, the guardian I appointed to protect the Cedar forest. They slaughtered the Bull of Heaven, and they threw its carcass at the feet of Ishtar. These two mortals have shown contempt for the divine order itself." "They had help," replied Shamash, the sun god, who had sent the 13 winds that turned the battle against Humbaba. "I gave them my protection. The fault is not entirely theirs." "That makes it worse," Enlil responded. "You should not have aided them, but what is done. The question now is the punishment." A silence fell over the assembly. Then Enlil spoke the words that would change everything. "One of them must die." Shamash protested. "Why must they be punished at all? Everything they did was done with courage and strength. Is that not what we made mortals for?" But Enlil was unmoved. The sacred order had been violated, a price had to be paid, and because Gilgamesh was 2 parts divine, protected by his mother's blood, the sentence fell on the one who had no such protection. "Enkidu will die," Enlil declared. "Not Gilgamesh, Enkidu." The dream dissolved, and Enkidu woke in the darkness of his chamber, drenched in sweat, the words still lingering in his mind. He lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what he had seen pressing down on his chest like a stone. When morning came, he told Gilgamesh everything. His friend listened in silence, his face growing pale. "It was only a dream," Gilgamesh said, though his voice carried no conviction. "It was not a dream," Enkidu replied quietly. "You know it was not." In the days that followed, Enkidu's mood darkened. He wept as he thought of the great cedar door he had fashioned for the temple of Enlil, speaking as though it was beside him. "I brought you from the forest with my own hands," he said. "I shaped you with my own strength. If I had known what it would cost me, I would have taken an axe to you and let the river carry you away." His thoughts turned bitter. He cursed the trapper who had first discovered him at the watering hole, the man whose fear had set everything in motion. And he cursed Shamhat, the priestess who had drawn him from the wild and into the world of men. "You took me from my home," he said, his voice trembling. "You made me human. But for what? So I could die in a city surrounded by walls, instead of living free among the animals?" But the god Shamash, hearing the curse from the heavens, intervened. "Why do you curse the priestess, Enkidu?" the sun god called down to him. "She gave you bread and beer fit for a king. She clothed you in fine garments. And she gave you Gilgamesh, the greatest companion any man has ever known. Because of her, Gilgamesh is your friend. Because of her, you have known what it is to be loved. Would you trade all of that to run with the gazelles again?" Enkidu fell silent. The anger drained from him as quickly as it had come, and in its place was something more painful. The knowledge that Shamash was right. Everything he valued, everything that had given his life meaning, had come from leaving the wild. He had been free among the animals, yes, but he had been alone. Shamhat had given him the world, and the world had given him Gilgamesh. He took back his curse and blessed her instead. "May kings and princes love you," he whispered. "May your beauty never fade. May you be honored above all women." But the reversal brought him no peace, because that night a second dream came, and this one was far worse than the first. He found himself seized by a creature with the face of a lion and the talons of an eagle, a being of terrible power that dragged him downward through the earth. He struggled and fought, but could not break free, and when the descent finally ended, he found himself standing at the threshold of a vast, dark house. This was the House of Dust, the realm of the dead, the place where every mortal soul would spend eternity. He stepped inside, and what he saw stripped every last trace of hope from his heart. The dead sat in rows in total darkness, their bodies draped in feathers like birds. They crouched in the dirt, stripped of everything that had made them who they were, eating dust and clay from the ground as they stared lifelessly into the darkness. Worse still, there was no distinction between the people here. Kings sat beside their servants, their crowns gone, their authority meaningless in the realm of death. Priests who had once spoken for the gods now ate dust alongside the beggars they had looked down upon. There was no reward for a life well lived, no punishment worse than this for the wicked. Everyone came to the same place. Everyone ate the same dust. Everyone sat in the same darkness forever. This was what waited him. This was what waited for everyone. When Enkidu woke from this dream, something had broken inside him. He told Gilgamesh what he had seen, and for the first time the king of Uruk had no words of comfort to offer. The illness began the next day. It started as a weakness in his limbs, a heaviness that would not lift no matter how much he rested. Within days it had spread through his entire body, and soon Enkidu could not stand without help. He could not eat. The man who had once run with gazelles and wrestled the bull of heaven could barely lift his hand from the bed. Gilgamesh never left his side. He brought water and pressed it to Enkidu's lips. He spoke to him through the long hours of the night, telling stories of what they would do when Enkidu recovered, the journeys they would take, the feats they would accomplish together. But as the days passed and Enkidu grew weaker, the stories began to falter, and the silences between them grew longer. "Do you remember the cedar forest?" Enkidu said one evening, his voice barely a whisper. "How afraid I was before we went in." "You were braver than I was," Gilgamesh said. "Every time I woke from a dream, shaking like a child, you were there to steady me." "I wish I had died there," Enkidu said, "on my feet, with a weapon in my hand, beside my friend. Not like this, not wasting away in a bed like an old man." Gilgamesh gripped his hand, but could not speak. For 12 days, Enkidu lingered, growing weaker with each passing hour. On the final night, he turned to Gilgamesh one last time. "Do not forget me," he said. "Never," Gilgamesh whispered. "Not for as long as I live." Enkidu closed his eyes. By morning, he was still. Gilgamesh did not move from his friend's side. He sat there throughout the entire day, holding Enkidu's hand, waiting for him to wake up. For 6 days and 7 nights, Gilgamesh refused to let the body be taken for burial. He paced around it, spoke to it, raged at the gods who had taken his friend. The people of Uruk watched from a distance, afraid to approach their king in his grief. He had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped acknowledging anyone who spoke to him. On the 7th day, he saw a maggot fall from Enkidu's nose. He stared at it for a long time, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. Enkidu was not sleeping. Enkidu was not going to wake up. Enkidu was dead. And one day Gilgamesh would be dead too. He would sit in that same house of dust, eating clay in the darkness, his strength and beauty and kinship meaning nothing at all. He arranged a magnificent funeral for his friend, commissioning a statue of Enkidu in gold and lapis lazuli, so that at least his image might endure. He made offerings to every god of the underworld, great bowls of carnelian and lapis, jars of honey and butter, hoping to secure some small comfort for Enkidu in the darkness below. But when the funeral was over and the offerings had been made, Gilgamesh looked at the walls of Uruk, at the city he had built, and felt empty. None of it mattered. None of it would save him from the fate that awaited all men after death. He stripped off his royal robes and dressed himself in the skin of a lion. Without a word to his people or his court, the king of Uruk walked out through the gates of his city and into the wilderness, alone. He was going to find the secret of eternal life. He was going to find the one man who had cheated death. And he would not stop until he did. Part 6. The Edge of the World. Gilgamesh wandered the wilderness for weeks, then months, with no destination in mind except away. Away from Uruk, away from the throne, away from the place where Enkidu had died. He wore only the lion's skin and ate whatever he could catch, raw meat torn from the bone and roots pulled from the earth. His hair grew long and matted, his body, once oiled and perfumed, became gaunt and weathered. Anyone who saw him would have taken him for a beggar or madman, not the king of the greatest city in the world. He killed lions in the mountain passes, not for food or protection, but because the violence gave him something to do with the rage and grief that burned inside him. At night, he would sit by whatever fire he could build and speak to Enkidu as though his friend was still beside him, asking questions that would never be answered, laughing at memories that now cut like knives. But beneath the grief was something worse: terror. Enkidu's vision of the House of Dust haunted him, the dead sitting in darkness, eating clay for eternity, kings and beggars side by side, stripped of everything they had been in life. That was what waited for him, and no amount of strength or courage could change it. Unless, that is, someone had already cheated death. There was one man, according to the oldest stories, who had escaped the fate of all mortals. His name was Utnapishtim, and the gods had granted him eternal life after he survived the great flood that had destroyed the world at the beginning of time. If anyone knew the secret of immortality, it was him. He lived at the edge of the world, beyond the waters that no mortal had ever crossed. His path now clear, Gilgamesh broke camp and set out to find the immortal man. His journey took him to the very limits of the known world, to the twin mountains of Mashu, where the sun rose each morning and set each evening. The mountains were vast beyond comprehension, their peaks reaching up to support the heavens and their roots descending down into the underworld. Between them lay a passage, the tunnel through which the sun god Shamash travelled each night from west to east, emerging at dawn to begin his journey across the sky once more. The gate to this passage was guarded by creatures that would have sent any other man fleeing in terror. They were scorpion men, half human and half scorpion, their bodies radiating a divine aura so intense that merely looking upon them brought the taste of death to any mortal's lips. One scorpion man studied Gilgamesh as he approached, taking in the lion skin, the gaunt face, the wild eyes of a man who had been pushed beyond endurance. "No mortal has ever come this way before," the scorpion man said. "Who are you, and what brings you to the mountains of Mashu?" "I am Gilgamesh, king of Uruk," came the reply. "I seek Utnapishtim, who lives beyond these mountains at the edge of the world. My friend Enkidu has died, and the same fate awaits me. I have come to learn how death might be overcome." The scorpion man exchanged a glance with his mate. They could see the divine blood in Gilgamesh, the 2/3 that set him apart from ordinary mortals, but they could also see the 1/3 that made his quest hopeless. "The path through the mountain is 12 leagues of total darkness," the scorpion man warned. "No light reaches it, for it is the road the sun travels at night. No mortal has ever walked it and survived. You will be swallowed by a darkness so complete that you will forget your own name." "Then I will walk in darkness," Gilgamesh said. "I have already lost the only light that mattered." The scorpion man studied him for a moment. In all the ages he had stood guard at the mountains of Mashu, He had only met a handful of mortals, and none had ever spoken with such grief in their voice. "I can see the pain you carry, Gilgamesh," the scorpion man said, his tone softening. "Go then. The gate of the mountain is open to you. May the mountains of Mashu keep you safe, and may your feet carry you to where you need to be." Gilgamesh bowed his head in thanks and stepped forward into the tunnel. The moment he did, darkness closed around him like a fist. It was not the darkness of night, where stars offer some small comfort and the moon traces a path across the sky. This was the total absence of light, a blackness so absolute that Gilgamesh could not see his own hand before his face. He walked forward with his arms outstretched, feeling nothing but the stone walls on either side, hearing nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the scrape of his sandals on the rock. For league after league he walked, the darkness pressing in on him from every side. Fear came in waves, a primal terror of one who had been stripped of their senses. More than once he considered turning back, but each time the image of the house of dust rose in his mind, the dead in their feathers eating clay, and he pressed on through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, when his legs were aching and his mind had begun to play tricks, he saw something ahead, a faint glow, barely visible, like a single star seen on a cloudy night. He stumbled toward it, then ran, crashing forward through the last of the tunnel until he burst out into light so brilliant that it nearly blinded him. When his eyes adjusted, he found himself standing in a garden, unlike anything he had ever seen. The trees bore leaves of lapis lazuli, deep blue and gleaming. Their branches were hung with fruit of carnelian, red as blood, and the ground was carpeted with precious stones that crunched softly beneath his feet. It was beautiful beyond description, a garden made by the gods for the gods, and Gilgamesh stood in it, filthy and half-starved, a ragged figure among wonders. But he barely noticed. Beauty meant nothing to a man who could only think of death. He pressed on through the garden until he reached the shore of a vast ocean that stretched to the horizon in every direction. This was the edge of the world, the great water that encircled all of creation. Somewhere beyond it lay Utnapishtim and the secret Gilgamesh had come so far to find. On the shore, he found a tavern, and sitting inside was a woman. Her name was Shiduri, and she was an alewife, a keeper of beer and wine at the boundary between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond it. But when she saw Gilgamesh approaching, she quickly bolted the tavern's door. The figure coming toward her looked more dead than alive, a wild man in animal skins with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. He could have been a demon or a ghost, or a madman come to do her harm. Gilgamesh pounded on the door. "Open this door, or I shall smash it in! I have not come this far to be denied now." "And why should I do that?" came a voice from above. Gilgamesh looked up to find Shiduri standing on her roof, keeping a safe distance from the wild man below. "I am Gilgamesh, king of Uruk," he called up. "I seek passage across the ocean to the home of Utnapishtim." "If you are truly a king," Shiduri called down, "why are your cheeks so hollow? Why is your face so drawn? Why do you look like a man who has made a long and terrible journey?" Gilgamesh leaned against the doorframe, his voice breaking as he answered. "My friend, Enkidu, whom I loved more than anything in this world, has died. The same fate that took him is coming for me. I'm afraid, Shiduri, I'm afraid of death, and I cannot rest until I have found a way to escape it." Chidori's expression softened, and she looked down at him with eyes full of compassion. She had seen grief before, but never like this. Never a man so consumed by it that he had abandoned everything he was. "Gilgamesh," she said gently, "you seek what can never be found. When the gods created mankind, they kept immortality for themselves and gave death to mortals. That is the way of things, and it cannot be changed." She sat cross-legged on the roof, and Gilgamesh did the same below, his emotions calming. "Instead of chasing what you cannot have," the alewife began, "why not enjoy what you do have? Fill your belly with good food, wear clean clothes, bathe in fresh water, dance and make merry, cherish the child who holds your hand, love the wife who lies in your arms. This is the lot of mankind. This is enough." Her words were kind and wise, and another man might have listened. But Gilgamesh could not. The house of dust was all he could see when he closed his eyes, and no amount of good food or dancing could erase that vision. "Tell me how to cross the ocean," he said. "Tell me how to reach Utnapishtim." Chidori sighed, seeing that nothing she said would change his mind. "There is a ferryman called Ur-Shanabi who serves Utnapishtim. He keeps his boat on the far side of this shore, and with him are the stone ones that allow safe passage across the waters of death. Find him, and perhaps he can take you across. But Gilgamesh, the waters beyond this shore are lethal. If even a single drop touches your skin, you will die." Gilgamesh thanked her and set off along the shore. When he found Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman was tending to the mysterious stone ones the alewife had mentioned, sacred objects whose nature Gilgamesh did not understand. In his grief and frustration, he saw only obstacles to overcome, smashing them before the ferryman had a chance to speak. Ur-Shanabi stared at the destruction in dismay. "Do you know what you have done? Those were the only things that could carry us safely across the waters of death. Without them, there is no way to make the crossing." "Then find another way," Gilgamesh said, his jaw set. "I am not turning back." The ferryman looked at the wild, haggard man standing before him, noting the desperation in his eyes. Finally he nodded. "There may be one alternative. Go into the forest and cut 300 punting poles, each one 60 cubits long. You will use them to push us across the water, one at a time, discarding each pole after a single use so that the deadly water never touches your hands." It was a monumental task, but Gilgamesh threw himself into it with the fury of a man with nothing left to lose. He felled trees and stripped them bare, working without rest until 300 poles stood ready on the shore. Then they loaded them onto the boat and set out across the waters of death. The crossing was treacherous. Gilgamesh stood at the stern, driving each pole into the water and pushing with all his strength, then casting it aside before the lethal current could creep up the wood into his hands, one pole after another, each one used once and discarded, the boat inching forward across waters that would kill him with a single touch. When the last pole was spent and land was still distant, Gilgamesh tore off his lion skin and held it up as a sail, letting the wind carry them the final stretch. The boat scraped against the shore of an island that no mortal had ever reached. standing on the beach, watching them approach with an expression of quiet curiosity, was an old man. Utnapishtim, the one mortal who had been granted eternal life, looked nothing like what Gilgamesh had expected. He was not a warrior or a king. He was simply an old man, weathered and calm, standing at the edge of the world as though he had been waiting there for a very long time. "You look terrible," Utnapishtim said, studying the ragged figure before him. "Why are your cheeks so hollow? Why have you come so far in such a wretched state?" Gilgamesh fell to his knees on the sand. "My friend Enkidu is dead, and I'm afraid to die. Please, tell me how you found eternal life. Tell me the secret so I do not have to share his fate." Utnapishtim looked at him with an unreadable expression. Then he sat down on the sand beside the broken king and began to speak. Part 7. The Flood. Utnapishtim did not give Gilgamesh the answer he wanted. In fact, he began by telling him something he did not want to hear at all. "Why do you chase sorrow, Gilgamesh?" the old man began, a hint of sorrow in his voice. "You are both man and god, your body shaped by the divine, and yet here you sit in rags, your face burnt by the wind and your body wasted. You have exhausted yourself with grief, and what has it achieved?" He shook his head. "Did the gods ever build a palace for the fool? Did they ever seat an idiot on a throne and tell him how to rule? You, who were born to be a king, have been living like a wild animal, eating raw meat and wearing a lion's skin. This is not wisdom, Gilgamesh. This is madness." Gilgamesh said nothing. He had not come all this way to be lectured. But Utnapishtim was not finished. When he spoke again, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who had watched the world longer than any mortal was meant to. "Man is like a reed snapped from the riverbank. One moment he stands tall and green, the next he is broken and carried away by the current. The young man in his prime, the young woman in her beauty, death comes for them all, and it comes without warning. No one has ever seen the face of death, no one has ever heard its voice, yet it cuts us down all the same, as it has since the beginning." He gestured toward the ocean where the light was fading. "Look at the mayfly on the water. It lives for but a single day. It sees the sun just once, and then it is gone, as though it never existed at all. That is mortal life, Gilgamesh. That is what you are." He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. "The great gods held an assembly long ago. They fixed the fates of all living things. They established both life and death, and they gave each to whom they chose. But the day of death, that they kept hidden. No mortal knows when it will come. It is the only mercy the gods have shown. But you are alive. Gilgamesh said, his voice raw. "You sit here at the edge of the world, immortal, while every other mortal who has ever lived has gone to the dust. The gods gave you eternal life. Tell me how. Tell me what you did to deserve it, so I can do the same." Utnapishtim looked out across the water. "I will tell you," he said, "but you will not like what you hear." And so, as the waves lapped gently at the shore, the immortal man began to tell his story. "Long ago, before the flood, before the world was remade, I was a king in the city of Shuruppak, a city on the banks of the great river Euphrates. But the gods had grown tired of mankind. Humans were too many and too loud, their noise rising to the heavens and disturbing the sleep of the immortals. Enlil, lord of the earth and the most powerful of the gods, who concerned themselves with the mortal world, had finally had enough. Mankind would be destroyed, wiped from the face of the earth by a flood so vast that nothing would survive. The gods swore an oath of secrecy. None of them would warn the mortals of what was coming. Mankind would go to its death unknowing. But one god broke ranks. Ea, the god of wisdom, who had helped make mankind, could not bear to see his creation destroyed without being given a second chance. Ea was bound by his oath and could not speak to any mortal directly, but such a constraint would not bind the god of wisdom for long. He came to the house where I slept, a simple dwelling made of woven reeds, thin enough for a whisper to pass through, and instead of speaking to me directly, he spoke to the wall instead. "Reed wall, hear my words," Ea spoke aloud. "Tear down this house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and seek only survival, for they will not help you in the trials to come." When I heard the god's words, I understood his plan at once. He had not spoken to me directly, but had addressed his words only to the wall. That I happened to overhear what he said, well, that was hardly his fault. I began building immediately. The people of Shuruppak must have thought their king gone mad as they watched me tear down my house for timber and pour barrel after barrel of pitch to seal the hull. When they asked what I was doing, I told them I was building a vessel to sail and visit the gods. A half-truth that satisfied their curiosity. When I had finished, the boat was larger than any vessel before or since, as wide as it was long, with 6 decks and 7 compartments. I loaded the boat with everything I could. My family, my craftsmen, the animals of the field, both wild and tame, and all the silver and gold I possessed. By the time the vessel was complete and provisioned, the horizon had begun to darken in a way that no one had ever seen before. The storm came at dawn. It was unlike anything the world had witnessed. The gods of wind and weather unleashed their fury simultaneously, tearing the sky apart. Rain fell in sheets so thick that the air itself seemed to turn to water. The ground shook as though the foundations of the earth were breaking apart. Rivers burst their banks, flooding the plains and swallowing cities whole, drowning the fields that had fed millions. By the second day, the water had risen above the rooftops. By the third, it had covered the hills. People who had climbed to high ground watched in horror as the water followed them upwards, surging forward without mercy. They clung to trees, to rocks, to anything solid, but one by one, the flood took them. Even the gods were terrified by what they had unleashed. Ishtar, who had agreed to the plan, looked down and wept at the destruction. "How could I have agreed to this?" she cried. "These are my people. I helped create them, and now they fill the ocean like fish." The other gods cowered beside her, weeping and covering their mouths, huddled together like dogs in a storm, horrified by the scale of what they had done. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged. When it finally ceased on the 7th day, I opened a hatch and looked out upon a world that no longer existed. There was nothing but water in every direction, an endless grey ocean stretching to the horizon. The silence was absolute. No birds called, no insects hummed. Every living thing that had walked or crawled upon the earth was gone. Utnapishtim stopped the story for a moment and wept. Gilgamesh could see that the story still weighed heavily on him, a wound that had never fully healed. Finally, he continued. My boat finally came to rest on the peak of a mountain, the only point of land still above the water, and there I waited. Days passed, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, the waters began to recede. I released a dove from the boat. It flew out, circled, and returned, finding no place to land. Then I released a swallow, and it, too, came back. Finally, I released a raven, and this time it did not return. Somewhere, land had emerged from the water. When I finally stepped from the boat onto dry ground, I built an altar and made offerings to the gods, burning cedar and myrtle so that the sweet smoke rose into the heavens. The gods, who had also been starving since the flood destroyed their temples, and the mortals who tended them, gathered around the smoke like flies, desperate for the nourishment of sacrifice. Then Enlil arrived and saw the boat. His fury was immediate. Someone survived! No life was to be spared! Who among us broke the oath? Ea stepped forward, unflinching. It was I, he said, but do not blame me, Enlil. Blame yourself. Your punishment was too great. You would have destroyed everything, every innocent alongside every criminal. There were better ways to discipline mankind than wiping them from existence. The other gods murmured in agreement. Enlil's anger slowly cooled as he looked upon me and my family, the last remnants of the world he had tried to destroy. For a moment, I feared he would still destroy me, but then he boarded the boat and took me and my wife by the hand. He touched our foreheads and spoke words that no mortal had ever heard before. Until now, you were a mortal man, Enlil declared, but henceforth you and your wife shall be like the gods. You shall live forever, far away, at the edge of the world, where the rivers flow forth. And so it was done. We were granted eternal life, the only mortals in all of history to receive such a gift. We were taken to this distant shore, beyond the waters of death, to live in peace for all of time. Utnapishtim fell silent. The waves lapped gently at the shore. Somewhere above them a bird called out across the empty ocean. Now you know my story, Utnapishtim said, turning to Gilgamesh. The gods held an assembly to decide my fate. They chose to grant me immortality as a reward for surviving the flood. But the flood is over, Gilgamesh. It happened once, and it will never happen again." He looked at the young king with something that might have been pity. "Who will assemble the gods on your behalf, Gilgamesh? Who will argue your case? You're a great king, perhaps the greatest who has ever lived. But you are mortal, and that is something even you cannot fight." Gilgamesh sat in the sand, looking at the ocean. He had travelled to the edge of the world, walked through darkness that no man had survived, crossed the waters of death themselves. And the answer, after all of it, was that there was no answer. Immortality had been given once, under circumstances that could never be repeated, and the door had been closed behind it. He had come all this way for nothing. Part 8. The Return. Gilgamesh sat in the sand for a long time after Utnapishtim finished his story. The old man watched him in silence, letting the weight of the truth settle in. Finally, Utnapishtim spoke again. "You say you want to live forever, Gilgamesh. You say you would do anything to conquer death. Very well, let me set you a test. Something far simpler than defeating death. If you cannot pass it, then you will know for certain that immortality is beyond you." Gilgamesh raised his head. "Name any task. I will not fail." "Stay awake," Utnapishtim said. "That is all. Do not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights. Sleep is the younger brother of death, merely a shadow of it. If you cannot even defeat sleep, how do you imagine you could defeat death itself?" It was a simple challenge. A man who had walked 12 leagues through total darkness, who had crossed the waters of death on 300 punting poles, who had killed Humbaba and the bull of heaven, surely such a man could stay awake for a few days. Gilgamesh sat up straight, set his jaw, and fixed his gaze on the horizon. He would not sleep. He would prove himself worthy. But exhaustion is not an enemy that can be fought with strength. Within moments of sitting down, before Utnapishtim had even turned away, Gilgamesh's eyelids began to droop. His head nodded forward, jerked back, then nodded again. The weeks of wandering, the grief, the devastating realization that his journey might end in failure, all of it crashed down on him at once. He slumped sideways onto the sand. He was asleep before Utnapishtim reached the door of his house. "Look at this mighty man who seeks eternal life," Utnapishtim said to his wife, shaking his head. "Sleep has already settled on him like a fog." His wife looked at the broken figure on the beach with pity. "Wake him," she said gently. "Let him go home. He has suffered enough." "Not yet," Utnapishtim replied. "He will deny that he slept. Men like Gilgamesh always do. We need proof." Each day that Gilgamesh slept, Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread and laid it beside his head, marking the wall to keep count. 1 loaf for each day, left in the open air where the heat and the damp would do their work. Gilgamesh slept for 6 days and 7 nights. When Utnapishtim finally touched his shoulder and woke him, Gilgamesh started upright, disoriented, the sand falling from his cheek. "I barely closed my eyes," he said immediately. "Sleep almost took me, but I fought it off. I've been awake the whole time." Utnapishtim simply gestured to the loaves of bread lined up beside him. The first was dried out and covered in mould. The second was stale and crumbling. The third was damp and sagging. Each one was more degraded than the next, a visible record of the days that had passed while Gilgamesh lay unconscious. The evidence was undeniable. 6 loaves, 6 days, and Gilgamesh had slept through every one of them. Something collapsed inside the king of Uruk. Not his body, which had collapsed long ago, but the last trace of hope that had kept him moving forward. He could not defeat sleep. He could not defeat death. He had travelled to the edge of the world and found nothing but the confirmation of what Utnapishtim had told him from the start. "What do I do?" Gilgamesh whispered. And for the first time the question was not a demand, but a plea. "Wherever I turn, wherever I look, death is waiting. It sits behind my eyes when I sleep. It walks beside me when I wake. Where do I go now?" Utnapishtim did not reply, but instead called for Ur-Shanabi, the ferryman who had brought Gilgamesh across the waters of death. "Take this man to the washing place," Utnapishtim told him. "Let him bathe in fresh water and wash the filth from his body. Comb out his matted hair, give him clean robes to wear, garments fit for a king, and then take him home." Ur-Shanabi led Gilgamesh to a pool of clear water, where for the first time in months the king washed himself. The dirt and blood and ash of his long wandering dissolved in the water, and when he emerged, dressed in clean white robes, he looked like himself again. Not the wild-eyed madman who had pounded on Shiduri's door, but a king, diminished by grief, aged by suffering, but a king nonetheless. They were preparing the boat for departure when Utnapishtim's wife spoke up. "Husband," she said, "this man came all this way, endured all of that suffering, and you would send him home with nothing? Surely there is something you can give him for his journey." Utnapishtim considered this. Then he turned to Gilgamesh and spoke. "I will tell you a secret thing, Gilgamesh, something known only to the gods. At the bottom of the sea, deep beneath these waters, there grows a plant. Its thorns will cut your hands like a rose, but if you find it and eat it, it will restore your youth. It will not give you eternal life, but it will turn back the years and make you young again." It was not immortality, but it was something. Gilgamesh wasted no time. He tied heavy stones to his feet and threw himself into the water, sinking down through the depths until his lungs burned and his vision blurred. At the very bottom, among the rocks and the silt, he found it, a plant covered in thorns that pierced his palms as he pulled it free. He kicked for the surface, lungs screaming, and broke through the water as his vision began to fade, the plant clutched in his bleeding hands. He held it up for Ur-Shanabi to see, laughing with a joy he had not felt since Enkidu was alive. "I will take this back to Uruk," he said, his voice full of a new energy, "but I will not eat it yet. First I will test it on an old man in the city to see if it truly restores youth, and if it works, then I will eat it myself and be young again." He even gave the plant a name, the plant of heartbeat. They set off across the water, Gilgamesh cradling the plant as though it were the most precious thing in the world. For the first time in months he spoke of the future rather than the past. He spoke of Uruk, of what he would do when he returned, and the man he would become. The darkness that had consumed him since Enkidu's death began at last to lift. After many days of travel, they stopped by a pool of cool, fresh water. Gilgamesh, hot and dusty from the road, set the plant down on the bank and waded in to bathe. The water was perfect, clear and cold, and he closed his eyes for just a moment, savoring the feeling of being alive, of having something to hope for again. And that is why he did not see the snake. It rose from the water silently, drawn by the fragrance of the plant. It slithered onto the bank and took the plant in its jaws before disappearing back into the pool. As it went, it shed its skin, leaving the old husk behind on the rocks. When Gilgamesh opened his eyes and saw the empty spot where the plant had been, he sat down in the water and wept. "Was it for this that I labored?" he said to Ur-Shanabi, his voice hollow. "Was it for this that my hands bled and my heart broke? I did not use the plant for myself, and now a snake has taken it. I have gained nothing." Ur-Shanabi could think of no words of comfort, so simply sat beside the king as he wept. Eventually Gilgamesh rose from the water, dried his face, and continued walking. There was nothing else to do. The plant was gone, the quest was over, all that remained was the road home. When the walls of Uruk finally appeared on the horizon, Gilgamesh stopped. He stood in the road and looked at his city, seeing it as if for the first time. The walls stretched for 6 miles across the plain, their foundations laid by the 7 sages at the dawn of civilization. Within them stood the great temple of Ishtar, the orchards and the marketplaces, the homes of the people he had once terrorized and later abandoned. It was all still there. It had endured while he wandered, chasing a dream to the edge of the world. The city had not needed him to be immortal. It had needed him to be its king. He turned to Ur-Shanabi, and when he spoke, his voice carried something it had not held before. Not the arrogance of the tyrant he had been, not the desperation of the grieving man he had become, but something quieter, something that some might have called wisdom. "Come, Ur-Shanabi," Gilgamesh said, "climb the walls of Uruk. Walk along them, look at the foundations. Examine the brickwork, see how the walls are made, how strong they are, how they have stood since the beginning. Were these bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages themselves not lay these foundations?" He swept his hand across the city, stretching out before them. "This is my legacy. Not the cedar forest, not the bull of heaven. These walls, this city, the people within it. This is what will endure when I am gone." The king of Uruk walked through the gates of his city. His people gathered to meet him, uncertain at first, for the man who returned was not the same man who had left. He was quieter now, his eyes carrying a sadness that would never fully leave him. But there was a steadiness to him that had not been there before. the calm of a man who had looked into the abyss and found his way back. He had not conquered death. He had not found eternal life. But he had learned something that the gods in all their power had never needed to learn, that a mortal life, brief and fragile as it was, could still mean something. That the walls we build, the people we love, and the stories we leave behind are the only immortality any of us will ever know. Gilgamesh, who had seen the deep, who had traveled to the edge of the world and back, would rule Uruk for many years to come. And when death finally came for him, as it comes for all men, his name lived on, written in clay, pressed into tablets that would survive the fall of empires, the rise of new civilizations, and the passing of 4,000 years. I've been David Rintoul for Deep Dive History. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.